Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Crazy stuff to talk about again today. All right, so in this unit, we're talking about the challenges to American ideals over time. Situations in which we, modern day, look back on how certain groups of people, how their experiences in the United States, by today's standards, absolutely fall short of the ideals of America. Ideals being that everybody is created equal, which is in the Declaration of Independence, how everybody is equal citizens, how everybody should be treated the same regardless of race or gender or nationality. If you're a citizen of the United States, you should be treated a certain way. That is the American ideal. There's quite a few times throughout our history that we as a society have fallen short of that. In this unit, we're going to be specifically talking about African Americans and the Civil Rights Movement, immigrants, different groups of immigrants throughout time in American society, and Native Americans and how their experiences, looking back on it present day, their experiences didn't live up to the ideals that America we had set for ourselves. So today, we're going to pick up with the Civil Rights Movement for African Americans, more or less the experiences that African Americans felt in the United States under laws by the United States government. There's a whole bunch of racism, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that African Americans experience. A lot of what we're going to focus on is how the government official laws were designed to keep African Americans in a second-class citizen position long after the 14th Amendment is passed, which guarantees that all citizens should be equal. All right, without further ado, let's get started. Crazy stuff to talk about. So in a previous lesson, we had talked about the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. 13th Amendment ended slavery. 14th Amendment made freed slaves full citizens. 15th Amendment gives African Americans the right to vote. Hooray, fantastic, so there shouldn't be any more issues, right? Well, we had talked about in the previous lesson how poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, even not allowing African Americans to take advantage of stuff like the Homestead Act fully because they didn't have access to the colleges and the Morrill Land Grant Act. All of those things basically still kept African Americans in a subservient position. And so that moves up to about 1900. We're going to pick up today around 1917, all right, of the journey that African Americans have went through in the United States and the extra challenges that have been placed on them by the government. All right, so World War I, here's what happens, all right? World War I breaks out, we're going to get involved in 1917, all right? This is over in Europe. There is a massive amount of soldiers needed in World War I, all right? So the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, we'll get to him in a second, decided to get a huge force of soldiers together, American soldiers, and send them over to Europe, who had already been fighting this war for a few years and were really worn out. So when the president, Woodrow Wilson, who was considered in history to be a fantastic president for his organizational and his leadership abilities during World War I, puts together his troops and gets his army together, he allows African Americans and white soldiers both to be in the military and send over to Europe. Now, this shouldn't be too much of a surprise because in the Civil War, which was right before the 13th Amendment, slaves that had escaped to the North were allowed to serve in the United States military's army. So this isn't a new thing that African Americans are allowed to serve in the military. And I really wish I could say here, and then African Americans got the same pay and equal treatment as white soldiers. No, that's not what happens in World War I. Actually, we take a step back in World War I. This is the president, Woodrow Wilson. All right, considered to be a fantastic president because we're going to end up winning World War I. He's kind of a hero. He has these 13 points. There's all those others to talk about in U.S. history, where he is thought of very highly in American history, generally speaking. However, Woodrow Wilson, he's a racist. There's no other way around that. He did not think African Americans should serve in combat with white Americans, all right? And you could be like, well, maybe he thinks, interracial tension, it could be a problem. Nah, Woodrow Wilson, while he is the president, thinks the KKK is doing good work in the South, protecting Southern culture. That's a hard one to defend right there. Now, so he's a bad guy. This is where it gets really difficult in history and in civics. We talk about individual people and their individual views on things. Yes, that idea is bad, but classifying any one thing as good and bad is very difficult to do in history because people are made up of a lot of different experiences and views. Anyway, but for this lesson, yeah, this ain't good. Here's what's weird with this situation. Woodrow Wilson wants to segregate the military. He segregates most of the federal government, all right? We're at this point 60 years after the Civil War, 50 years after the Civil War, and he is trying to make sure that the government remains segregated, right? He does not want African Americans in his administration. So the soldiers who sign up to fight go over to Europe. They're not allowed in combat. There's all types of wild reasons why it could be. It's all racially motivated. And so they might be given a reason and like, well, and it could be something completely made up because it's racism in general. So it's not like there's scientific backing for it. Like, well, the reason black people can't serve in combat is because black people can't see at night. They have really bad night vision. Now, I say that half joking here because I want to reference my story later on. I guarantee you, I have read that somewhere that was an actual excuse given why African Americans weren't allowed in combat, and trying to come up with that source because it seems insane that I wanted to show that source here. I could not find it. So take that one with a grain of salt. But you don't have to have a justification for racism because racism in general is not usually based in science. Anyway, so a lot of times they're just says, sorry, we don't have to give you a reason. You're an African American. We're not going to let you serve in combat. That's that. Well, France, who is our ally, as we go over to over to Europe to fight, France is really low on soldiers, and France asked America, "Hey, can we have some soldiers?" Now, one of the actual official reasons, all right, that African Americans were viewed as unfit for combat is there is this unsubstantiated belief that they were cowards, that they were afraid, and that they wouldn't fight. Whatever. So France is like, hey, America, can we have some troops? America's like, our troops are staying together. Our AEF, American Expeditionary Force, which were nicknamed the Doughboys, they're all staying together. And they're like, really, we will rent soldiers from you. And America's like, ooh, there's money involved. And they look around, they're like, nope, we got no soldiers to spare. France is like, well, you have a whole bunch of black soldiers there. Can we use them? And then like America's like, really? Like, because America wouldn't even think about doing that because, again, it's racially motivated. It's bonkers. And they're like, sure, if you want them. And France is like, yes. So France takes a group of American soldiers, all right? And they handpick the very best because they're not going to take all the African American soldiers, but they're going to take a handful of African American soldiers, and they're going to take them, and they're going to fight for France. This is the 369th in France. This is a photograph of them. These guys taken into France. Now, granted, they're handpicked, so that they're obviously elite out of the group of all African Americans that wanted to fight. Absolutely drop hammers on everybody that they fought. The Germans got the France's highest honor in their military, and they're the first Americans, I believe the only Americans, to have done so up to present day. So they clearly showed, given the opportunity, African Americans can fight just as good as any other soldiers. You would think America would see that from this instance in World War I and realize, hey, maybe we're just dumb. But they don't. This doesn't register at all. All right. So African Americans, they're treated as heroes in France for their fighting for France. Then at the end of the war, when they come back into the United States Army, they are once again subjugated to second-class citizens, even within their own army, because they're not allowed into combat. So the question here is, why did African American soldiers who are part of the United States military fight for the French and not the Americans? The key word there is fight. Because you could be mechanics, truck drivers, and all that, and do that for America. They'll let you do pretty much any job short of actual combat for America. So, but pause me, answer that completely, and we'll move on. All right. Oh, A. Phillip Randolph. This is a cool story. This dude's name is like super easily forgettable. I've noticed that over my years and years of teaching. You'll remember this whole story, but his name, A. Phillip Randolph, people were like if I put his name on a test, my students will look at it and be like, clearly never talked about this guy. But if I like tell the story, like, oh yeah, I remember that whole story. I don't know why it is. Maybe he goes by the initial in the front. All right, A. Phillip Randolph. We're going to jump ahead. So after World War I, soldiers come back and they're kind of grumpy, rightfully so. You get sent over to fight for the country, but then you're treated as second-class citizens in the military. You come back, you're treated as second-class citizens. There's some grumpiness, all right? Well, December 7th, 1941, all right, the United States is attacked at Pearl Harbor by Japan, all right? This is going to bring the United States into World War II. So this is, generally speaking, about 20 years after World War I ends. All right. So we're attacked at Pearl Harbor. America gets pulled into World War II. America declares war on both Japan, who's the one who attacked us at Pearl Harbor, and Germany and Italy, who had been at war in Europe, and we have allies there. We basically declare war on everybody. They all declare war on us. All right. So once we are attacked at Pearl Harbor, we declare war on them. Well, as this picture here shows, it says the attack begins in the factory. America's going to have a lot of success here in World War II. In large part, not just because we're like better than everybody else. We can make stuff faster than everybody else. We needed, we're coming out of the Great Depression, everybody's looking for a job, all of a sudden the factories open back up. We need to mass produce stuff for the war. All right, we draft a whole bunch of soldiers, we send them to go fight. We need all the factories hitting on all cylinders. Now, here's what's interesting though about needing all the factories filled with workers. There's not very many men left. The reason there's very little men left is because a whole generation of men got drafted to go fight around the world on a two-front war. So who's that leave? Women. So there's a huge push, right, and a huge sense of pride for women to step up and do the jobs that men traditionally did in World War II in the factories. There's tons of propaganda posters at the time trying to get people into the defense industry. So these aren't people who joined the military, but they are going to build stuff in the United States for the military to use. Here's a whole bunch of the posters for encouraging people to join the defense workforce. Basically, the factories that are making stuff for the defense. You notice it's a lot of women here because it is this big motivating concept that women are going to go into the factories and they're going to mass produce, and they do in record numbers. Absolutely amazing work. You say amazing now, like I can't believe it happened, and then I think it's more of we've been pretty sexist for a long time, but they need, meaning the United States government and the military needs all these workers in the factories to make these guns and bombs and stuff so the soldiers can go use them. Look at these pictures. What is very clearly missing from any of these posters? African Americans. There's no African American women here. There's no African American man here. Why is that? Because African Americans at the start of World War II, kind of a holdover from Woodrow Wilson of wanting to segregate the United States, has they are not allowed to be hired to work in the defense industry. So if it is a company that is making something for World War II, they are not allowed to hire African Americans. Well, there's a lot of African Americans. We're coming out of the Great Depression desperately. One job, this is clearly unfair. They're being discriminated against because of their race. Here's the guy, I told you you would forget his name, it's A. Phillip Randolph. And he has a quote here that equality is the heart and essence of democracy, freedom, and justice, equality of opportunity in industry and labor unions, schools and colleges, government, politics, and before the law. There must be no dual standard of justice, no dual rights, privileges, duties, or responsibilities of citizenship. No dual forms of freedom. He's already been fighting for this, all right, for equality. He's one of the first civil rights leaders, we'll say, at the time. This is a photograph of him a little after all the story I'm getting ready to tell you happens. So he was a little younger when the story I'm getting ready to tell you happens. But he realizes this is bull to not allow African Americans into the defense industry. All right. So he is going to organize a march in Washington, D.C. with African Americans to go talk to the president and tell him this is unacceptable and you need to stop it. The president at the time is this guy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. All right. FDR is currently on his third consecutive term. It's a whole nother story. And so FDR is the president, and I imagine this is kind of how the story goes, that he's at his desk, trying to get all this stuff organized for World War II, like we're getting involved in this massive war, and one of his advisors come running, Mr. President, there's going to be a protest in Washington, D.C. Now, this is Washington, D.C., so FDR is like, okay, there's a protest every day. He goes, no, this protest is different. And FDR is like, oh, okay, well, why is this one different? And his secretary or whoever the guy is says, because they're black. Now, FDR's already, he has he's put the first woman in his cabinet, and he has the first African American in his cabinet. So he's not Woodrow Wilson level a racist. And he goes, okay, black people can protest too. That's fine. It's not a problem. It goes back to writing, and the secretary sits there and waits for it to sink into FDR's mind. FDR's writing. Said they were black and they're marching in Washington. Oh my gosh, you're all black. And the guy's like, hey, right, exactly. Now the reason that triggers something with FDR and them is because the capital of the United States in 1941 is segregated. There's a black side of town and there's a white side of town. The capital of America is segregated. There's only a couple of hotels that will allow black people to stay there. They have so many African Americans showing up for this march, there's not enough places for them to stay. So he's like, who's in charge? Guys, like, I think it is this guy, Phillip Randolph. And FDR's like, well, bring him in here. So Phillip Randolph probably was not expecting to actually meet with the president. He's like, oh, they go out and get him. He comes in, he's like, yes. And FDR's like, what is this about? Phillip Randolph, I imagine, has all his pie charts he starts flipping over, and he's like, haha, well, if you would see the production quality of African Americans in the defense industry would drastically increase your production, and since African Americans aren't allowed in the defense industry, that seems to be a bad idea. And FDR stops him. He says, what? Did you just say African Americans aren't allowed in the defense industry? And Phillip Randolph is like, yeah. And FDR's like, what moron signed that into law? Phillip Randolph is like, you did, sir. You made that law. FDR is probably signing so many things that he didn't read it because this doesn't really follow FDR's mindset. FDR's like, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll make you a deal. If you will leave and go and call off this whole march so that they have time to get home and not have the issue at night of not having enough hotels for these people and they're basically stuck in the street and it's just going to escalate into more issues. If you will call off the march before you can make it outside the door, I'm going to have an executive order saying African Americans are allowed in the defense industry. And Phillip Randolph is like, cool. And he leaves. And FDR does just that. He passes an executive order, which is like a law over the federal government, which the president can do. And it says that you cannot discriminate based on race, creed, color, national origin in the defense industry. That it is completely unacceptable to do that. So, during World War II on the home front, while the posters look like this, in real life it looked like this, where African Americans going into the defense industry, black people, white people, men, women, everybody is working together in the defense industry to mass produce stuff for the war effort. The massive, like these B-52 bombers, we could produce one every 62 minutes during World War II. And it was thanks to the massive amount of people who came together, black, white, men, women, to work in the defense industry and create these weapons to help the soldiers win the war. Now, I say all that because you're like, heck yeah, man, America. Woo! FDR. Thank goodness he ain't like that Woodrow Wilson guy. God, Woodrow Wilson guy is awful. FDR, that's the man. He knew racism was wrong. He knew irrational fear of a race of people and to treat them as second-class citizens. He knew that was wrong. I wish we had more people like FDR. Hold on now. Just as I said, there's no good guys and bad guys. FDR is also the same president at the same time. That right? Executive Order 9066. This one is what rounded up Japanese Americans and put them in internment camps because they're Japanese. And people were terrified of them because of their race. It's, again, when you try to view things as good and bad in history, it gets really confusing because that is not how things typically work. But this is a huge win for African Americans. So why was FDR willing to meet with a Phillip Randolph so quickly? All right? And what was the issue with that particular protest in Washington, D.C. at the time that it was? And we had talked about, like, why was FDR like, okay, we got to get these people out of here before it gets to nighttime because there will be an issue in Washington, D.C. at the time. All right, answer that. We're moving on. We're going to stick with World War II here. There's a handful of stories that I could point to in World War II with Buffalo Soldiers, African Americans getting to right in combat. There's quite a few breakthrough moments for African Americans in World War II where they get treated equally in the military and fantastic stuff happens. The most extreme version of this is one of the very first ones that are going to happen in World War II, and it's with the Tuskegee Airmen. So the way this starts is that African Americans, still a holdover from Woodrow Wilson, were not allowed in active combat. All right? African Americans keep asking, we would like to be in active combat, we would like to be in active combat. The higher ups, whoever, they're like, you know what? We're going to, and it's called the Tuskegee Experiment because it's supposed to prove all the racists are right, that black people are afraid to fight. Like that is the motivation for this, as crazy as this ends up being. So they're like, fine, once and for all, we will prove that African Americans are inferior soldiers. So the Tuskegee Experiment handpicks a group of men from the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute and trains them to be pilots. Now, these aren't just your run-of-the-mill people. They're going to be officers. Like, they're not just being picked off the street, given 2 hours of training and put in a plane. They're handpicked because the last thing they want to do is, like, when these people fail, all right, we don't want them to say, oh, you weren't given the best equipment. Oh, you weren't trained the best. Oh, you didn't pick the very best. So they're going to prove they handpick the very best. They train them longer than anybody else to give them the very best equipment to prove that they're going to fail as fighter pilots in World War II. Well, you handpick the best. You train them better than anybody else, and you give them the best equipment. Guess how they're going to do? Really good. They wreck shop in World War II. I would love to go through battle strategies of them being the defensive, but they just proved everything. There's no cowardice. There's no courageous, there's all these stereotypes they thought they would see. They saw the complete opposite. There's a movie out called Red Tails, which is based on the experiences of the Tuskegee Airmen, and they are called Red Tails because they're planes. This is I don't know if this is a replica or just a redone airplane modern day, but the end tails were red. All squadrons had their own emblem. This one just happened to be a red tail is what they chose. It's nothing like racially motivated by having a red tail. It was just, that was the symbol, and that's what they became known as the Red Tails. They are the most decorated and most successful group in World War II. They won everything that you can win from their position. The Congressional Gold Medal. I mean, once they showed the success, this is when at least the military is like, hey, y'all think we might have been racist? Because we've had all these great soldiers all this time and we've thought they couldn't fight. Okay, put African Americans into combat full force, and all these groups made up of African Americans are very successful. They're still segregated though. So even though they're allowed in combat, they're not mixing with white soldiers. It's all segregated units, but success pretty much across the board when African Americans got to prove themselves. All right, so the question is, explain how the Tuskegee Experiment proved many of the racist stereotypes towards African Americans wrong. Like basically how they set out to prove, that they couldn't be, successful in combat. How did the Tuskegee Airmen prove that wrong? Answer that, and we'll move on. All right. So the big change here, as we'll start talking in future years, the actual civil rights movement, African Americans made massive gains in society during World War II. They're in the defense industry, they get to be in combat, they're able to prove, every time they were asked to prove themselves, they did. And there's like, even the military is like, oh, we might have been racist for a while, so hooray, breakthroughs for African Americans. What makes it even crazier is the fact that the whole reason, in the end of World War II, we find out about the Holocaust. And we find out what Hitler had been doing. We've realized that we had been fighting this war to stop oppression, to stop really bad governments from treating people really bad, from holding them down and not treating everybody in their government as equal. All right, like that's literally why we fought this war. All right, then as soon as World War II was over and all the African Americans were like, absolutely, I'm so glad we finally get treated as equal. As soon as they get back to the United States, the United States expects African Americans to just return to being second-class citizens, to return to being, less than their white peers. And there is a across-the-board view change here by African Americans, and they're like, nah. One of the first guys who's going to stand up is a guy named James Farmer. James Farmer is going to, he has the Congress of Racial Equality, which is what CORE stands for. Up north, all of a sudden, he's showing back up to segregated neighborhoods, and he says, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going back to segregated. We're not going to go back to being second-class citizens again. We just fought a whole war against that. We're not doing that. That's old. We're not doing that anymore. All right? Now, it still would be too dangerous to say any of that stuff in the South. But in the North, James Farmer's the one that comes out with the Congress of Racial Equality and fought against the racist policies with segregated neighborhoods and stuff in the North almost immediately after World War II. Because African Americans after World War II realized, wait a minute, the society's cool with just going back to the way things are. We're not. So you'll start seeing this conscious focus by the African American community after World War II to realize, no, we've come too far. We've passed every test that you've given us. We're not going to go back and sit quietly and idly by while we are, our rights are not being given to us and they're being taken from us. So James Farmer, his kind of motto is freedom now. He's important because he's kind of the very first one that comes out and is known for fighting for this, and he does it a lot in the North because, as we will get through in further lessons, it is dangerous to do this in the South in the 1940s. So the question here is, why was there a much stronger push after World War II for African Americans to be treated as equals in America? What had motivated that focus? Basically, what had happened in World War II in which the focus becomes, we need to be treated equal? Like, what was the motivating factor after World War II that caused that increased focus on that? All right, answer that completely, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.